Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's courageous conversation, creating a truly inclusive culture. My name is Tammy Simmons Parker, and I have the privilege of being your moderator for this hour. We welcome all who wish to share your videos during our time here, where we'll have about 40 minutes of conversation, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. Feel free to share your thoughts, comments, experiences, and questions in the chat at any point during our time together today. We encourage interaction for this very important conversation. Just a gentle reminder, please make sure that you're muting yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you. Embracing inclusion and accessibility means a better understanding and addressing of the issues around disability, accessibility, and the stigma surrounding mental health. Today, we are joined by Michael Boyton, Town Manager of Medway, Massachusetts, Trish Stiles, Town Administrator of Bennett, Colorado, and Melissa Wiley, Deputy Town Administrator of Erie, Colorado, to have a candid conversation about the challenges and mind shift needed to be truly inclusive as a local government organization and community, as well as becoming aware of opportunities to increase accessibility for all. I want to welcome our panelists and thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate you. So to start us off, I'd like each of you to tell us about your background in 3 minutes or less, including both your professional and personal trajectory, so we can understand how you came to sit on this panel today. Michael, would you lead us off, please?
Sure. Good afternoon. I suppose, as you said, in certain parts of the country, it's still morning, so good morning to those. I started in municipal government 31 years ago in the town of Franklin, Mass., the town I grew up in. And I started as a member of the finance committee and then an elected councilor. And I said, you know, I like this. So I started with the desire to move into municipal management. And for the last 26 years, have been involved in 4 different communities here in Massachusetts. Starting with the town of Mendon, Sutton, Mass, in central Massachusetts, and then Walpole for almost 13 years, and now here in Medway for the last 7. And it has been really rewarding. As a person with a disability, though, that goes all the way back to age 12. I was that normal, healthy kid that was playing Little League Baseball and was at boxing lessons, and in the span of 3 hours, went from boxing lessons to a quadriplegic and on a ventilator. So it took me about 7 or 8 months to have the ability to walk again. And I have had this physical disability now for the better part of 41 years, 41 plus. So the first 10 plus years were in the days prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And obviously for the last 31 years operating as a person with a physical disability post ADA. And it's interesting because as disability is very obvious, it's very present, but I don't think about it. When you look in the mirror, you're not looking at a person with a disability, you're looking at a person. And that's the MO that I try to bring when I talk to anyone. I'm not looking at the individual as a person with some type of a stereotype or some type of a description other than another human. That is very helpful. I think that the challenges that we see in the disability world, so to speak, still exist. So we've made major improvements in that arena since 1990 when the ADA was enacted, but we still have a long way to go, and we still have major challenges. My career path has allowed me to focus a little bit on that. Again, trying to focus primarily on being a good manager and running the communities the best that I can, and whatever we can do to better identify improvement in that area of disability awareness has been something that is becoming more of a focal point over the last probably year or so. As we have all really opened up that dialogue about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is one of those arenas that, for lack of a better description, has kind of fallen by the wayside. And we'll talk more about that as we get going today, I'm sure.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Trish, I'd like to hear from you, please.
Sure. Trish Stiles. I'm from Colorado. I'm actually a Colorado native. Pretty proud of that. But I currently serve as the town administrator in a town just kind of east of the Denver metro area in Bennett, Colorado. I've been here, 11 and a half years. I've been in local government for about 17 years. Have been all across the country and came back home. This is definitely where home is. As I've been town administrator in kind of a small and growing community, we've done some really unique things. We really have felt that, health is an important component of how we move forward in it. That's been kind of interesting from, our comprehensive plan has a health component. It was actually funded by health dollars several years ago. So we really take pride in our health and wellness. And we think about that, I think the healthier our employees are, the more resilient our organization becomes. I think the more productive our employees become. And so when we think about health overall here in Bennett, we try to think of it in a very holistic way. It's not just the, numbers at the doctor's office. It's really about the whole person and really leaning into that wholehearted living, both personally and professionally in our organization. And so we really took that to heart. I think a lot of this mental health topic really just came up from COVID, honestly, that feeling of disconnect, a lot of feelings of anger and frustration, and really trying to figure out how to bring our team together in a way that really looks at the person as a whole, looking at how they're functioning both professionally but also personally, because all of that gets brought to the office. If you think otherwise, you're sorely mistaken. That is just a part of who a person is. And so really looking at our employees from that human standpoint and not just from people or robots doing tasks and jobs, but really about who a person is and what they bring to the organization as their whole self. So we really embarked this past year now on something that we call Golden Egg Workshop. It's kind of a little joke. I'm a huge fan of the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And we were in a meeting talking about all the issues that we had. And I was like, oh, we have all these golden eggs. We're expected to produce all these golden eggs. And I said, you know what? Those geese don't make golden eggs if they're not healthy and happy and functioning at their best. And so that's really what started us on this embarking on kind of who we are as an organization from a personal and professional standpoint, and all of the work that we've put in to making sure that our employees are at their best. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the results from that, but it's been an amazing process and we're really proud of it.
Fascinating and fantastic. Thank you, Trish. Melissa.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Melissa Wiley, and I'm the new Deputy Town Administrator of Erie, Colorado, which is a small town just outside of Boulder, Colorado. Prior to joining Erie, I was the Director of Denver Peak Academy, which is the City and County of Denver's Innovation and Analytics team. I did that for about 8 years. And prior to both of those things, I worked for some nonprofits. I worked for the U.S. Economic Advisor to Northern Ireland on the peace process. So I had also some time at the State Department. So some federal government experience, and then more recently, local government. As a child, I was just 5 years old and playing with 2 dogs when those dogs attacked me. The attack was really bad. The dogs essentially ripped off my face. It was my 5th birthday. And I went on to have about 36 reconstructive surgeries from the time I was 5 to the time I was 23. In the middle of a lot of hospital stays, a lot of time in ICU after the attack was, of course, all the commentary that happens when you have any sort of facial disfigurement. And I think also the commentary of if you're a woman and you're not traditionally beautiful, and what that sort of happened in my childhood. So through that experience, I really developed a passion for social justice, for public service. And I just thought, if I get through this, which in, my childhood years seems like a big if I get through this, then what am I to do with this pain? Like, what is the purpose of this pain I've gone through? And for me, it really was a thought of preventing other people from going through these similar things. And where can I best do that? And for me, the answer was government and public service, and thinking that if I had a seat at the table, maybe I could speak for people who had gone through different life experiences. I could speak from a place of empathy, and then also just quite frankly, navigating the healthcare system and all those surgeries and the bureaucracy with comes with suffering, which I'm sure a lot of people have experienced. There's a lot of bureaucracy with death, with sickness, all those spaces. And as I was working in process improvement in Peak Academy, I was really inspired by how do we help people go through process better, because we all have other things going in our life, and bureaucracy and confusion and frustration with process can cause also a lot of hardship. So that was a big inspiration for me to especially look at innovation and process in government, to think through who engages with us and how can we make those processes more equitable and easier for people to navigate, especially on their worst days. So that's just a bit about me, and I won't take too time. I know we have a lot of questions, so I'll hand it back over to you, Tammy.
Melissa, I appreciate it. Thank you all for your intros. So the first question is a little bit of a take on your introduction. So as local government leaders living with disabilities, why don't you talk a little bit more about what your experience has been in those two places? Michael, we'll bring it back to you again.
Interesting. I don't think I've experienced anything different than most other managers encounter in terms of the approach that the community has. Again, the community has expectations for their own. Everybody expects something for themselves, right? So in the big picture, we look at it like everyone wants to make sure that the ambulance gets there on time, their trash is picked up, that the water isn't brown, that we have good schools, etc. They don't really care at that point in time whether you have a physical disability or a mental disability or an emotional disability or what have you. They just care that the person that's in the job is professional and can handle it. So in that context, I've never encountered a perception. There have been a couple of instances. I've had that been referred to as the quote unquote the cripple at town hall from time to time. That was once. We had the issue with. When I was in Walpole, we had an issue with our high school where they were walking into the end of the project and the state.
Uh-oh.
Oh, there we go. The state had hit the town for an issue relative to the accessibility needs for the new building. And so they said, well, we'll ask the new town administrator to come up because he's got a cane. If he can walk it, anybody can walk it. And it was really, no, that's not appropriate. We really need to go through the process and make this thing work properly. But in general, I would say that it's been more recent that I've become a little bit more aware of the challenges that are still there. As an individual that deals with this, obviously you deal with the disability aspect on a day-to-day basis. You deal with the physical components, you deal with some of the challenges, but you put it behind you because you can't think about it. You can't let it overcome, you can't let it overtake you, so to speak. But the more and more we think about where we are, I think it's allowed me to become more aware of the challenges of those in the community. I've always had that extra level of sensitivity for those that work for us, for my organizations. And we can talk, if you'd like, we can get into some of the specifics about helping people out, because not every single disability is going to be like somebody like me that walks with a cane. You can't specifically see it. And you have to be perceptive, and you have to be open, and you have to understand that some folks have challenges that you can see and maybe they themselves haven't recognized, and you can be an assistant, you can provide assistance. But in general, I would say that it has allowed me to be a little bit more compassionate. It's allowed me to give me a better sense of somebody else's needs. And now, hopefully, we can start to move the dial even further towards saying, let's end some of the greater barriers that exist.
Could you comment on your experience in local government in that space?
Sure. I I think one of the things that we really recognize in our organization is this idea of, this wholeheartedness, this whole human that comes to work. And I think oftentimes, it's easier to sort of ignore those other things. We get so focused on work and getting things done. And, I get that I'm a person that generally operates in that kind of arena anyway. But, when you start to really recognize that there are other things going on that will eventually affect the workplace, and really leaning into that, I think has served us in a much better way, rather than sort of going, oh, that's uncomfortable, I don't necessarily want to deal with that. I agree. Sometimes, disability, or you don't necessarily see what's going on with a person. And so that idea of really seeing their whole self, to understanding that, and maybe I relate to this a bit as, being a mom. And sometimes, a lot of the moms in the group might relate to, oh, well, she's a mom, she's going to be too distracted by taking care of her kids or doing the other things. And it's like, you're right. I do have that part of my life, and I have to sort of sometimes bring that along, and those struggles and the things that are going on relate. And so we talk about, how do you do that? How do you bring these other things along in the workplace? And, it revolves around recognizing and addressing issues that are going on, providing flexibility, and really leaning into, that whole employee, whether it just be, I need them to run the budget and get that done, or that person's a new mom and, struggling with a newborn. We recognize that sometimes when you have children, sometimes we get a little bit down and get the baby blues, and maybe that can be something that gets brought in. But to really lean in and recognize all of that, I think is really important for us. As we see our employees here in the town of Bennett, they are not just people building widgets or, doing tasks. They're their whole self. They've got a whole lot of interesting things. And I think what we have also found is that makes us a better team, right? This is the one question I ask when I interview every person that joins our organization. What are you going to bring to our team that makes it better, that makes it a little bit,
I gotta go look in my car and see if my headphones are in the car.
that gives it a little bit more unique perspective? And so I think it's really important that, we sit in that uncomfortableness, because it's going to work in our favor. If we ignore it, then things sometimes tend to rear their ugly heads. And, that's just not a space that, we're comfortable in our organization and working from. So we try really hard to dive into what's going on to build those relationships, because I think one of the things that we find at the end of the day, it makes our team so much better and so much stronger. And when you have something like a pandemic, or you have just, maybe a water main break, or just whatever those things that come up, if your team is already really resilient and very strong, you will get through those things in a much better way, because you're recognizing, yep, somebody's struggling today. We do thumbs up. We did so many Zoom meetings where we did thumbs down, and so that we could see visually, okay, I got a thumbs down. Let's make the connection. Let's find out what's going on, because it will stop and hinder the work if we don't.
Yeah. So it sounds like, Trish, you're talking about, in your experience, in your role, really being able to look for people, actively creating a space where folks can be honest about what they're experiencing, and then giving them support, because you see them valued as whole humans in that space with the totality of what we experience, which is fantastic. And Ms. Wiley?
Yeah, so I wish I could say some more positive things about my story, but I'm going to be really honest, with the hopes that it changes someone in some way. I've noticed that the more visible I am and the higher I come in leadership, the harsher the comments get to me. And I'll just give an example. So when I took this job in the town of Erie, the local media published an article that I was the new deputy town administrator, as they do, and they included a picture. And in my article, they also included all my qualifications, which included an Ivy League degree in public administration, leading Mayor Hancock's innovation team for the city of Denver, working for a presidential official in a peace process. And I'm listing these not to sound arrogant, just to say that I was qualified and I had an interesting story and background. And I think that if I was a resident, I would be happy that someone so qualified was working in my town. And the comments were, what happened to her face? Why is she ugly? Why does she look like that? Why would we have someone so ugly leading our town? So the communications director, the local media, of course, included all my qualifications and all my history. And this is to say that I don't think a lot of people read that, but they really looked at my picture and they really focused on that. I would say that that's a pretty common experience for me. Even when leading Peak Academy, I had to teach a lot of classes. I was up in front of people a lot, and I had a lot of commentary. I ultimately ended up working my story into Peak Academy twofold. One, because I wanted people to realize the power of story and how important it is to know someone before we form judgments. And two, because the situation I've had my whole life is that it's better for me to tell people what happened. Otherwise, I get overwhelmed with the commentary and the discussion, and it's just hard for people to focus on work or focus on what I'm bringing to the table because they're so preoccupied with that. So that has been so much of my experience. I don't want to say everyone's like that. I mean, certainly when my appointment ran, plenty of people were like, who cares what she looks like? Like, she seems great, you know? So there were definitely people to counteract that. The second part of that is I think I would be disingenuous if I try to minimize how hurtful that has been for me. So I do a lot of talks with kids on anti-bullying and storytelling. I spend a lot of time talking to kids. And I had one student ask me once, does it ever stop hurting? And maybe it takes a kid to ask such a brave question. But I answered him honestly. And the honest answer is no. It doesn't ever stop hurting when someone makes comments about you, especially when you feel like it's going to overshadow everything you've done, how hard you've worked, how much you've tried to be a good person and a good leader, how authentic your heart is. If those things feel like they're overshadowed by what you look like, it's a really hard space to be in. And I would say, I think a lot of women can relate to this too. Women are just so judged by how we look. And so even if I wasn't disfigured, I'm sure I would certainly also get comments of like, why does her hair look like that? Why is her dress like that? You know, women, just people comment more on women. And so I think what I need to say is the truth about how those comments have been, the truth of how they have hurt. And there's also been a lot of moments where I've thought about stepping back from the public eye for my own wellness. And so people say we want people of diversity in the highest levels of government. We often don't have a conversation about how we treat those people and how hard that is on someone's family and their life. And that if we want the best of the best in public service, something of our narrative has to change as residents and citizens too. That the best of the best sometimes don't want to live with those comments. So I feel like I've been brave and I've stuck it out, but I would be disingenuous if I said it didn't hurt. And I would also be disingenuous if I said there wasn't days where I was like, should I do something where maybe I'm not so visible? And really what keeps me in public service is the thought of maybe there are other people like me and they appreciate someone here who's willing to speak the truth to how much this is damaging our communities when we treat each other like this. So,
Melissa, that was powerful. I think it's so important to have conversations where you're not only speaking about it from policy perspective and general anecdotes, but to really get to the heart of how the way that we speak to people, speak about people, and the way we treat them impacts them because they're human beings at the end of the day. And it goes to one of the things I was thinking about when we're talking about issues of justice and equity. One of the things that is it's very key to me is understanding that when we put people to the side and we consign them to, not good enough, to this, to that, et cetera, we miss out on all of those wonderful qualifications, things that you shared, whether it's education, it's passion, it's integrity, it's character, it's the ability to do something well. And so I think we need to hear how, when we don't do that, we're affecting somebody, but we're also missing out for ourselves. So please always continue to share that. So a couple of, excuse me, little frog there. One of the things that I heard is that there are some things that folks may not be sensitive to, right? In the ways that we talk about issues of disability and issues of mental illness, et cetera. So what are some aspects of accessibility, aspects of supporting people that have mental health issues, et cetera, do you wish our local government leaders were more aware of? So you sit in a place where you are both the leaders and you're also people coming from those communities. So what would you want them to be more aware of as they're doing their work on a day-to-day basis? And any of the three of you can jump in if you feel an unction to do so.
I think where we need to be is that, and we talked a little bit about this before we got going today, that when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, we've really, as a nation, started down this road of saying, okay, it's 2021. A lot of these conversations are long overdue, and it's time to move in that direction. We put words together when we talk about inclusion of people with disabilities, and we put things out there that, to kind of go back a little bit to what Melissa was saying, is that there is an unintended consequence and there's a hurt to some of it. We use a term like reasonable accommodation. You can't use that term to accommodate any other quote unquote underrepresented population. You can't say that there's a reasonable level to accommodate a person of color or a person of an ethnic origin or a person with a different lifestyle, alternative lifestyle, let's say. You can't use that term because reasonable is 100% accommodation. Reasonable is 100% equity. Reasonable is 100% inclusion. When we talk about the aspect of folks with disabilities, where I think we start to lose this is that we begin to put things on there like reasonable, and we talk about thresholds. So if your project only costs less than 30% of the value of the building, you don't have to make major accommodation changes. If you're building a new building, X percentage of the building must be handicapped accessible. You must have at least one parking spot, or you must have one stall that's physically accommodating. What happens when we get to that point where we say, you know something, 100% of what we do should be accessible? Again, I think about this because when I travel, and some have seen me at the ICMA conferences, I'm probably one of the only ones, if not the only one, that travels with a mobility scooter. When we're talking about accessibility, an able-bodied person will step off the curb and make that, walk across the street, find that curb cut. And that curb cut could be half a block away, it could be a full block away. That's a challenge. Granted, there's an expectation. It doesn't make sense not to have curbs and not to have curb cuts and to have pedestrian safety, et cetera. But we need to be thinking about all of those challenges. My wife and I stayed at a hotel in Boston. We left the hotel, we followed the sidewalk, we came all the way around, we were about a block away and realized there was no curb cut. I needed to tell her to stop or continue on, and I'll do my best to catch up. As a public official, I'm looking at that saying, okay, there's a major design flaw here, and we have created a challenge. So when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, we need to understand that with folks with disabilities, this is the only segment of the population that we will put a dollar value to determine whether or not they can fit in. We need to change that dialogue.
Absolutely. I was going to sit with that for a minute. Trish.
I think for us in this process that we went through, we identified, this kind of goal setting path forward. We knew we had all these things to do. We were struggling through COVID. And so when we leaned in, and talked about, okay, let's really start being high performing. Let's look at ourselves. We started with the personal first. And I think it's really important when you want to work with your team to get them to be high performing, to really lean into what's going on with them. The personal has to come first. And I think the biggest reason why is because you're going to get emotional buy-in. When you start talking to someone about who they are as a person, who they are as to their vision and forward and having their goals met, they're emotionally connected to that, right? Like that's where the meat of who they want to be. And it might be something as simple as, traveling somewhere or redoing their kitchen, but then you start talking about this emotional buy-in. And we talked about the kitchen thing came up, and we said, well, why do you want a kitchen? And it wasn't just like, oh, I want new appliances, which feels like the very traditional, I'm going to buy new appliances and put them in the kitchen. It wasn't just that. It was this idea of really being with her family, of connecting with her children, to making dinners. And it was that emotional part that then we were like, that's where the nugget was. And you only get that when you start at that very personal level. We then took that to translate into what does that mean then when you come to work? And so we have a scoring system, as I'm sure many of you do, as how we kind of prioritize and rank improvements and projects in our budget process. It's based on what we call the 3 C's: condition, criticality, and capacity. Well, we decided let's add an emotional score to that. And so that was one of our outcomes through this process, was let's do a care score. Like, why do we care about this? What's our connection to this? And we did it both from a community care score. So is it a health and safety? Is it something that, makes our community a really amazing place? And so we added a score there. And then we added a score for your coworkers. Like, why are we doing this project? Is it because, we want to make process improvement in order to make our lives as employees like smoother and easier, and we want to help each other? And so we found that when you made the emotional connection personally, it was so easy to then think, how do we make emotional connection in our organization? And so those were some of the greatest little outcomes that we've had in this process, because we should be thinking not just, oh, I need to build a new public works facility. It's much more than that. What does it mean for our community? What does it mean for our employees? And, how do you gain more of that buy-in? Because once you have more buy-in emotionally, that's where I think people will go above and beyond in your organizations to really get things done, to be connected to it. And it just makes the work, I think, more rewarding and meaningful.
Absolutely. This makes me think about something that Melissa was talking about before we open the session officially, where, okay, so we talk about things we want local government officials to be aware of when we're talking about these kinds of issues. So there's law and there's policy, but then there's being aware of the humanity and there's changing the human heart. And so, Melissa, I wanted to hear from you on this particular thing, as far as what you would want people to know about issues of accessibility and issues of disability and such in their positions as local government officials, with the heart piece as well.
Yeah, this is actually a perfect segue to what Trish was saying. Part of our connection to each other is really knowing each other. And I'm sure we've all had this experience where we start to make up stories about someone we don't know. So especially if you're in a conflict, so you get in a conflict with someone and they say something, and it's not just what they say, it's the story you've attributed. They said this because they're like this, because this. So we will either make up stories, or we can actually know the story. And what happens is we often make up stories, and so those leave us in conflict or division, or we try to find the real story. The other thing, and I know I talked about this with my keynote with ICMA, but there's some really interesting research about our brains and whose stories we like to listen to and whose humanity we connect to. And just to be very blunt, our media, our movies, all of those things allow us a space where we are sort of conditioned to hear the stories of some people more than others, and to see the humanity of some people more than others. And what that sounds like is there's research to support that white people don't always have the same level of empathy for Black people, and it's unconscious. No one would ever say that, or maybe even know that, but that comes through our movies, our media, all these spaces. And so I think in my space, what I've really learned is the story of a beautiful woman is really neat, and everyone's all about that. And those are the stories we know, and those are the fairy tales and whatever. The story of a disfigured woman, not only is it a story I have to tell, but it's a story I know people might have bias against even hearing. So storytelling and connection is complicated because there is bias in our brain and in our brain development ever since we're children. And it sort of slants how we hear a story. We also have this space in life where we have a sort of an instinct sometimes to judge a story. And what this can sound like is someone's like, oh, so-and-so got lung cancer. Well, did they smoke? You'll hear that all the time. So instead of like, I'm really sorry to hear that, like, I'm really sorry that person is ill, it's this instant, like, what did they do to deserve it? So there's complexity in storytelling and there's complexity in brain development. And so I think as we come into the space of storytelling, what's important to think about is, how am I listening to this person's story? And what am I finding out about myself as I listen? There are laws and policies, and then there are our own heart, and to really confront what is happening to me when I listen to a story? What is happening to me when I make up a story about someone else? Why is that happening? And not have any judgment for that, but just have curiosity about how you can be better. One of the things I shared with Tammy before this session was, I think when it comes to the space of disability, if people are honest, there's a fear. So that example I gave of cancer, there's a fear of getting cancer, right? So we have that response, not because we're trying to be a jerk, but because we're so afraid. It's like, how can I have that not happen to me? So if someone says this person has lung cancer, you're not trying to be a jerk by saying, did they smoke? You're trying to say like, well, maybe I don't smoke. So am I going to be okay? Can I dodge that? So there's a real fear in the disability space. And I think when we're afraid of something, we're afraid of maybe I could fall and I would be in a wheelchair. Maybe I got too close to a dog and that could have happened to me. Maybe we feel this fear. And often when we have fear, we try to step away from it, step away from that person, step away from that space, instead of saying, it's okay to feel fear. It's okay that I have some unconscious bias. What's not okay is that I continue to live in a way that distances me from others and my community. So how can I confront those things in my own heart and recognize those things? And I'm not saying you have to say them out loud. Maybe you just say them to yourself and you work to change your own narrative. One of my favorite quotes is, changing the human heart is the work of a lifetime, and that's why you have a lifetime to do it. So giving ourselves the grace to say that we maybe have some fear, maybe you had some experiences in your life, maybe you knew someone who was sick, or you saw some different things and they make you particularly uncomfortable or fearful, or maybe take something like disfigurement. Maybe you're so used to, we have in our brain that we find attractive people to have symmetrical faces. So I could be jarring to you because the brain is sort of conditioned to favor a symmetrical face. That's just sort of our brain development. So to say, that's interesting, my brain sort of perceives this response, and that's my brain development of favoring a symmetrical face. And so I have to kind of challenge that. But just being curious and thinking about brain development and unconscious bias and what we were shown as a child, and giving yourself grace to change those things. The law can come, but if we don't decide to change, then change laws don't really change how we live.
Absolutely. Wow. Oh, I'm overwhelmed by the richness of what you all are presenting here today. And we are approaching our 40-minute mark for our session. And I have a question, but I want to pivot just a little bit and change a little from the visible disabilities to the invisible disabilities. So Trish, you had mentioned earlier that COVID has really highlighted mental issues. I know that there is a statistic from the National Institutes of Mental Health that had put a statistic of 1 in 5 Americans are dealing with a mental health issue, and nearly 1 billion people worldwide are dealing with mental health or substance issues. And COVID actually has caused those numbers to increase significantly. And so I just wanted to kind of set the stage for thinking about how do we make a more comfortable environment to discuss those things? How do we help destigmatize mental health issues? And how do we help people feel comfortable being able to talk about it and to get help? And with that, I have a specific question from one of our audience members who submitted this to me privately. And it says, I would love to hear from the panelists about balancing sensitive information relating to mental health and disclosure to managers and coworkers. I completely understand that I can share as much or as little as I want with my colleagues, but I struggle with the validity of more invisible struggles. So
yeah, no, I think for us, I think as leaders, we have to model that vulnerability. I think that that's probably, again, this was sort of my wanting them to lean in. And, I knew in doing that, that the outcome could be so good. And we've got so many great, like little nuggets of, how this has changed our organization, but it really had to come from me. I had a point where I was sitting, at home thinking how crazy this world was and feeling honestly like, ugh, I couldn't see the next day forward. It just felt very deflating. And you just, there's so much uncertainty. And so you have to really be open and honest about that. I think vulnerability does not mean total disclosure. It doesn't mean I'm going to tell you every little last thing about me, but I think I'm honest enough to say, yep, I'm struggling today, guys. Maybe I didn't sleep well. When I don't sleep, you don't want to be around me. I'm kind of a pill. But at least I can now say that's where I'm at. They recognize it. And there's like, okay, Trish kind of didn't sleep well. We're just going to steer clear of her today. She'll be great tomorrow. You have to be vulnerable. You have to, open up. And I think that's where I really felt, just this desire and need to bring that same thing out of my team in order for us to kind of get through the difficult times and the difficult situations. And a lot of it was COVID, do not get me wrong, but a lot of it is we're a tiny staff with a list to do that is a mile long and really high expectations from, our board of trustees. They think we just kind of produce magic on a daily basis. And I'm like, hello, there are people here trying to get all of this done. And so, I think it really starts at the top down. You've got to be open to really finding out what's going on with your employees, really leaning in to who they are, because if you don't, I think you're missing good opportunities and good nuggets in order to make the organization that much stronger. When we come together and connect as a team, I can just tell you, we do amazing things that I would challenge that an organization is not an organization of 30. We do things that maybe 300 or 500 or 1,000. That's how committed we are, because we know enough about each other, who we are, how we work, and what support we need in order to move forward. And that's the delight of having that vulnerability kind of shared. Again, it's not disclosure. We're not saying everything that's going on, but enough to say, I recognize in you something's different, something's off. How can I be of help? What can I do to be of support? And really, changing that idea from, we talk a lot about accountability to really like, how can we just count on each other as human beings? How can I count on you to support me when I'm having a bad day? And how can I count on you to make sure that we, change chapter 13 of the code because we need to do some policy changes? That's the stuff that we're talking about. And I think for us, you've got to be a little brave. You've got to, have a little courage to do it. But I think once you get over that sort of initial uncomfortableness, or this feels a little bit weird, when you get over that hump and you start to get that emotional buy-in from your employees, it just kind of opens up that door, and all of the possibilities just start coming at you. And it feels, I just have to tell you, it feels so good. Managers, isn't that what we want? We want to come to work and be like, oh, this is amazing, and I feel great about what's going on. And that's what's potential. That's what can be achievable, but you've got to be a little vulnerable to get there.
Mm-hmm. Tricia, thank you for sharing that. Michael, I see your mic is off. Did you have something you wanted to add to this point as well?
I think it following up on what Tricia said, I think as managers, whether we're talking about being the top, the town manager, or you're talking about department heads, your department managers, I think everybody needs to have that level of understanding that everyone that we deal with, everyone, whether it's our employees, or whether it's the members of the community, everyone's got some type of a struggle that they're dealing with. Sometimes they're going to be very very visible. It's going to be in your face, and you're going to see it, and you're going to have the opportunity to work with that person. And sometimes you have to be pretty perceptive, and you also have to be understanding every single day. There's a level of compassion that has to go into what we do with every person that we encounter. And yes, there are going to be times it's going to be challenging, but understanding that you know, each of us deals with our physical challenges or our disability challenges in a different way. The people that we work with, and I don't mean those that work for us, those that we work with need to understand that, to use that term that Trish used, we have a level of vulnerability and we have a level of needs as well. So that being the case, as a person with a disability, it would be hypocritical at best if I didn't understand the concerns that other folks have and to be able to work with them, to be able to try to help them be better at their job, because if they're better at their job, then the organization does much better across the spectrum. So I think to that extent, you know, living and working, living with a disability and working every day as a person with a disability, you tend to be a little bit more sensitive to those that work with you. And that open door policy becomes even more important.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have a question here in our chat for our group that I'd like to present. Have your communities try to extend the themes and values being discussed to the broader employer community, for example, through the economic development function?
I would say yes and no. Yes, that we do. I mean, again, people know that in Massachusetts, as an example, we have laws and we have responsibilities and we have accessibility demands. I don't think that we have done a great job, and I'll put myself in that disappointment category, if you will, of trying to express to folks in the community, the business community, et cetera, that we need to do a better job across the system. You know, whether it's dealing with better accommodations, better physical accommodations, and just simply better lifestyle accommodations for folks, we need to do a better job at that. And I'll put myself right at the top of the list because there are things that have gone on that, you know, after the fact you look at it and say, I should have picked up on that. Should have picked up on the fact that that business just opened up and we didn't have a conversation with them beforehand about accommodations and about where the handicap parking was going to be in that location. So those are the types of things that we're trying now to have better conversation on locally. And I think, yes, there are opportunities to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the questions I wanted to make sure we brought out. So obviously, you mentioned earlier in our conversation, we're at the 30-year mark for the Americans with Disabilities Act now. How much have we improved and where do you see us being able to go from here? Where do you see a really strong opportunity for us to do better?
We've done some amazing things as a nation towards better understanding the concept of disability. So 30 years ago, I think we were really focusing on people with physical disabilities, people in wheelchairs, people like me that walk with a cane. It was a physical disability issue, and it was about breaking down barriers. I think that we as a nation have done a fabulous job about expanding the definition of disability to more than just physical components over the last 30 years. And that's critical because, again, everyone has their challenges and we need to better understand it. And some of those do fall right into the bailiwick of what a disability is. Where I think that we have fallen short is that we still have, as I said, we still have an economic threshold that we place on what ought to be accessible. And an example, we just built a new DPW garage here in our town. And yours truly went to use one of the bathrooms, and that bathroom is not accessible. And I looked at it and I said, talked to the architect and said, wait a minute, why is this bathroom not accessible? Well, it didn't have to be per the code. Then I think we need to do a better job with the code because 30 years later, we shouldn't still be having a conversation based upon, well, it didn't have to be. And you really saved, by the way, you know what, let's face it, you saved $1,500 because that toilet didn't have to be a handicapped accessible toilet. I spent $14 million on a garage and a $1,400 toilet really made me feel embarrassed.
Yeah. And that makes me think, Michael, you know, how do we constructively help people to understand why that's important? I mean, a $15 million garage and a $1,400, that should not even have been a question that could be made accessible. So from a local government perspective, from bringing in community support around those things, what are some things that we can do to help people understand it shouldn't be a question of whether it's affordable. Accessibility is accessibility, and we need to make sure that things are done properly there.
For me, I guess we need to put people into places and educate. But I think this is the whole dialogue that we've had as a nation over the last year has been about better education. We need to find a way to have people understand that, and I don't mean just people with disabilities, I mean people in decision-making authority. So here in Massachusetts, it might be the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, it might be the Architectural Access Board. We need to have that conversation so that the people that do make the decisions on a more global basis, whether it's statewide or our partners in federal government, understand that, you know something, it is 2021. We're turning the corner and we need to make that change. We need to educate. We need to educate. We need to advocate. But we also have to just think about the things that we do in our own communities. And I mentioned this during the interview that we did, that, you know, a broken sidewalk to an able-bodied person or a cracked sidewalk or a heaving sidewalk might not be much of a challenge because you could step over that. But that could be a lifetime challenge for a person with a disability. And we talked about it. If you can't get from here to there, and we've done that subconsciously, we never do that intentionally. But if we've done it subconsciously, that person that's dealing with that as a person with a disability, that's altering, that's life-altering decisions that we need to be a lot more sensitive to.
Absolutely. And it's something that as a society, we have the ability to change. So awareness, education, advocacy, and putting the people in positions to make the right decisions. Fantastic. I see a hand raised. Semihar, if you would like to come off camera and unmute your mic, you can ask your question. I may be mispronouncing your name, my apologies. It's Semihar, you have your hand raised to pose a question. All right, they may be experiencing some technical difficulties. There is another question that's been posed in the chat from our participants. And the question is, we are moving towards having an equity inclusion office in our organization, which will work with both internal staff and external engagement. I'm worried that the words inclusion, equity, or diversity have become so politicized that any efforts might be seen as trying to make staff, quote, woke. Any advice?
You know, I'll take that. If that is a barrier, then change it. If that's going to be a barrier, then work around it. You know, I think the idea that, you know, you're really connecting your group of people together, and that's really at the heart of whether, you know, you're looking at, you know, diversity issues, equity issues, you're really trying to just bring people together. So if those words are trigger words and that doesn't work, listen, I work in a community that would probably be some pretty big trigger words for them. Change it to something else that makes sense for you, that does bring buy-in and does bring people to the table with kind of a more open mind, and to work it that way. And sometimes we just got to adjust and pivot a little in order to make it work. So if that doesn't work for your community, find something that does and just keep at it until you can start to make the work meaningful, and make some of those progressive and positive changes. It's too important not to, right? Like, don't let something like just the naming of that be a barrier to what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Trish. I have an additional question for the panel. I was recently asked by someone, when is the appropriate time to disclose a disability to an employer or a prospective employer? And there may be multiple levels to this very straightforward question. So I welcome any of our panelists to take that one on.
Let me tell you a quick little story. When I worked in Florida,
our staff members are currently helping other customers.
I was 6 months pregnant, and I'll be honest, I didn't disclose that during the interview process because I was worried that I wouldn't get the job. And so it was kind of an awkward thing to then show up on the first day and say, oh, hey, by the way, I am pregnant, and I'll be taking off here in a couple of months. You know, I did that, you know, thinking that that was kind of what was best for me. I think you've got to sort of, you know, if I had disclosed it, you know, I think I would want to have worked in an organization that would have said, that's okay. Like, we think you're a qualified candidate. We want you to be a part of the organization. And I probably would have been a little turned off if they had kind of taken and seen that as a problem. So I think you got to kind of go with your gut, and then, based upon that decision, make the choice to be in the organization that really is going to fit you. There's nothing worse than being in an organization where you just don't feel like you fit. And you might not be a rock star there, but you can go somewhere else and just, blossom and find yourself in a better organization. So make sure that when you're doing that, find the right fit. And for some, maybe still going and still doing that challenge might be a good thing, because maybe you can kind of change, as Melissa says, change some hearts. So it takes a lot of brave, skill set in order to do that. So I applaud those that, still take that on, because I know it's hard.
I think I would, I don't think I'd have any hesitation disclosing it whatsoever. I mean, again, for me, it's easy. I walk in the door and it's disclosed. I mean, that's pretty simple. But again, I think in the context, it's 2021. If there is a desire or a need or a wish to disclose it, don't have any hesitation whatsoever. Take it on, because again, we as employers have an obligation to try to meet those needs of our workforce. We have the obligation to meet the needs of our communities, and anyone who is not doing that, well, one of two things: one is a fool, and two is breaking the law. So I wouldn't have any hesitation disclosing whatsoever.
So we have just under 3 minutes remaining in our time here today. And I had one comment from someone I just wanted to share with the group. They wanted to make sure I just shared this. It's not a question. They wanted to share with everyone how important it is to realize that your own personal problems are not the only problems people face. And it's important to look outside yourself and try to be accommodating and ask questions to let people know that you really care. And I think that I've heard a lot of empathy and seeing other people, listening, letting them know their value throughout everything that the three of you have shared today, both from a personal perspective and also from a policy perspective in the way that we do business. And so with our remaining time, I wanted to offer you each the opportunity to share a final thought. Maybe there's something that didn't come out during today's discussion that you wanted to make sure folks left with today before they headed off to the rest of their day.
I'll jump in there. I think, one of the biggest takeaways is to recognize someone else's truth as their truth. I think sometimes when it comes to this space, people say, I don't know, it doesn't seem that bad, or do they really have that problem? Or we sort of second guess people, especially with disabilities that aren't as visible. And I think part of the healing is to recognize someone else's truth and lived experience, though it may be different from yours. And you may want to soften it or do different things with it to notice that someone else's lived experience and what they're sharing with you is true. And even if you haven't experienced any such thing, it's not really about your life. It's about listening to someone else's life. And I think as public servants, that's how we start to build better communities, is to really recognize people's truth. And I had a great public speaking professor in college who said that people need to live a life where they speak their truth. And if they're unable to do so, it will erode them. And if they're able to do so, it will set them free and put them in a space where they're connected to community. And so I think a good closing thought is speak your truth. As Trish said, if leaders can be vulnerable and speak that truth, that inspires others. And then when people do have the courage to speak their truth, believe them and bring them into the community.
Amen. Amen.
I would just add to that, I think it's ominous, the life-changing work that we really do, and to really own up and be a part of that, I think is just inspiring to me. I've been working really hard with this executive team and doing this, what some might describe as very touchy-feely stuff, but it works. It really does work. And, some of the lessons that we have learned in this emotional work that we've been doing has been shared with others. I'll just give you one takeaway. I had a share in our latest meeting where he's a coach. He coaches baseball, and he noticed one of his players not doing so well. He took one of the techniques and tools that we had done a couple of weeks ago, walked him through, let's change our thoughts and so that our outcomes are different. And he shared with us an email from that kiddo that had responded back with what a difference that had made in his life, how, he was on a different trajectory now, how just thinking about who we are and changing these little aspects and leaning into that just made him on a different trajectory. And I felt really excited because I felt like I got to share with this person who then got to share with somebody else. And then I thought, as we were talking about it, what if he shares that with someone else? And that is the power to start changing lives and people in the world. And if we don't start doing all of that, I think, we're going to be sorely sorry that we didn't, but we've just got such an ominous, power in really what we do as managers. And I think the more that we really take that to heart and lean into what we can do, there'll be no stopping us. There'll be no stopping our organizations.
I mean, my only comment would be, as both Melissa and Trish said, we're agents of change. Every single person that's on this is an agent of change. You
Yes.
can't change it globally unless you change it in your backyard first. And I think this is a message, regardless of what part of the equity, inclusion, and diversity topic you're focused on, that across the board, that we can make such positive improvements by just changing the focus that we have. And especially as we're talking about this today, the topic being disability awareness, understand, educate, and advocate.
Amazing. I have been absolutely humbled by what each of the three of you have shared today. This exceeded my expectations. I expected to hear about policy. I expected to hear about personal experience. I did not expect to hear the spiritual and the human in the powerful way it was presented today. So I want to thank each of you for coming here. There are additional comments in the chat from many of our participants appreciating your willingness to be vulnerable, for your authenticity, etc. So I will be sharing that with you afterwards. For everyone who came today to participate, thank you so much for your presence. Thank you for your comments and your questions. This recording will be uploaded and to the ICMA YouTube channel by the end of this week. So you'll be able to view it again or to share it with others. I want to thank everybody for being here and wish you a peaceful and productive day.